Let me begin by acknowledging traditional owners of this country, the Kaurna people, and acknowledge their custodianship of this land here for many thousands of years as the original scientists of this country here. I'm a Pidnyara and Narunga man from Central and South Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this panel this morning. And as you've heard this morning, First Nations people's health remains a priority for many of us as Indigenous peoples, but as non-Indigenous peoples, for the Academy, and for many people who are not in the room here today, who are working day in, day out, trying to improve the outcomes for our peoples. I might get our three panellists to come up, Dr. Chris Bourke, Professor Dawn Bessarab, and Professor Alex Brown, if you could come up and take the stage. And this afternoon's panel, titled 1 Year On from the Referendum, will traverse issues arising from the referendum. We'll touch on the referendum and those results and what they mean for our people, but also building on the conversations this morning. And I think AI and data related to Indigenous peoples is very topical, and we have a very strong movement about Indigenous data sovereignty, which we'll touch on this morning. And I think we are moving at a very fast pace with Indigenous data sovereignty, and also draw on the panel's experience, particularly across science and engagement, genomics, that Alex is really leading the charge across Australia, but also Indigenous knowledges and methods that Dawn is well renowned for. So thank you for joining us. So I might just quickly introduce each panel member. I'll start with Professor Bessarab, who's the Director for the Centre for Aboriginal Medical and Dental Health at the University of Western Australia. And Dawn descends from the Bardi and the Yidinji Bardi people from both the Kimberley and the Pilbara area of Western Australia, as a senior social worker and Indigenous health researcher with expertise in qualitative research, and actually is the designer of yarning. Many of you would have heard yarning, and really many of us have used yarning methods in our research over the years. Dawn specialises in the application of Indigenous research methods and critical and cultural approaches to health research, and really is a passionate leader in our communities. Dr. Chris Bourke leads the Indigenous Science and Engagement at the CSIRO. He's a Gamilaroi man and Australia's first Indigenous dentist, and he has extensive experience working in clinical positions in public and private sector, and was a member of the ACT Legislative Assembly with various ministerial portfolios from 2011 to 2016. Now the next fella, who hardly needs an introduction, Professor Alex Brown, a mentor of mine over many years, is an internationally recognised leading Aboriginal clinician researcher who's worked his entire career in Aboriginal health in the provision of public health services, chronic disease care, healthcare policy and research. He's held various roles across this country. He worked up the road here for a decade at SAMRI, and in 2022 he commenced a new position as Professor of Indigenous Genomics for the Kids Research Institute Australia and the ANU, and he's leading a national approach to ensure the benefits of genomics and precision medicine are realised for our people. So a very distinguished panel this morning, or this afternoon now. So thank you very much for joining us. So I'm going to start with the referendum, given that's the title of the panel. I might ask panel members, I might start with maybe Alex to get things started. Can you tell us how you felt waking up on October 15th, 2023, and how you're feeling now, a year after we've just passed the anniversary of the failed referendum to the Voice to Parliament?
Yeah, well, thanks for the chance to come here, and thanks for that question, James. Look, like childhood trauma, I've tried to put that day out of my mind, to be perfectly honest. I woke up the next day seethingly angry, like an anger that I hadn't felt almost in my entire life. An anger that was born of generations of our ancestors' fights for our future being thrown back in our faces as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And I'd realised that despite the fact that I come across as very jovial and quite cheeky, many of you would know, deeply at the heart of me, I'm angry. And I think, I won't speak on behalf of any other Aboriginal people, but a lot of the Aboriginal men I've worked with for years and years and years, particularly in Central Australia, talk about this feeling of intense anger that's very hard to contain and very hard to channel in the right directions and can be all-consuming. And it's born of the experience of poverty and marginalisation and racism. And it was really not hard to tie the dots between Australia as a racist nation and the way in which it chose to deal with a very reasonable request to be heard in things that mattered most to us as Indigenous Australians. And I still cannot believe that that was a really hard question to contend with. I can't imagine what sensible person would not think that that's a reasonable approach in some way. And I still cannot comprehend that whenever the opportunity affords itself now in contemporary Australian society to support Indigenous interests, we find a way as a nation to reject that very, what should be a welcome offering of Indigenous knowledge and process and understanding. How am I a year on? I'm still really angry. I think I'll be angry now forever, till my last breath. I'm probably more purposeful. I think that within a vacuum, there's always opportunity. I have to tell myself that, otherwise I won't get up every day. And I think that the push for what the voice could have represented moves on anyway. And I think our agenda around not merely a conversation of including us in stuff, and not just the importance of work towards equity, but I think there's an agenda that we need to push forward on, which is about Indigenous people's rights to define their own future as sovereign people. And that's a harder agenda to follow through on, but I think that's the one that that's the one I'm certainly focusing on. I might leave it there. I don't need a psychoanalytical session later, but...
We might all need it. Dawn, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I think when I woke up the next day, I felt absolutely gutted. And I couldn't believe that... I mean, I kind of suspected that it might go in the no direction, but I thought that in the end, people's common sense and social justice would prevail in recognising that this was an opportunity for Australia to move forward truth-telling and to change the landscape of this nation by acknowledging Aboriginal people as the First Nations people and giving them the rightful voice that we deserved and that we were denied through colonisation and still denied by the no vote. So, yeah, I was gutted. I didn't know where to put my face, how to go out into the community. I actually went into isolation for a whole week. I was paralysed. I just didn't want to engage with anyone. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just needed to stay in my house and try and process what had actually happened. And I thought that I was the only one that had experienced that until I started talking to the elders that we work with in our research. I'm part of a grassroots Aboriginal organisation. I'm the vice chair in my community, talking to committee members and community members and finding out that people were struggling and the racism, it was a green light for all the racists in the community to come out. Elders were saying that they felt scared to go into shops because of the way people were looking at them, comments that were being made. I found that when I finally got out into the community, people were ignoring me. They couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't know whether that was because people felt guilty, whether people felt that they didn't have to recognise Aboriginal people anymore because the no gave them full permission to actually show their racist views. And it still hasn't stopped. I talk to elders all the time and they talk about racist comments that they receive. They're scared to go to hospitals because they think they're going to get treated differently. So the trauma that Alex talks about is running deep in our community. And I was traumatised. A year on, I was very, very angry. I was also very disillusioned, questioning where to from here. The Reconciliation Australia did a national survey going around Australia talking to Aboriginal people about the result of the referendum and what they could do to try and address and pull it back together. They met with, I'm the Vice Chair of Langford Aboriginal Association, met with our association to talk to us around our thoughts in relation to the referendum. We felt that it had moved beyond reconciliation because we can't reconcile when that's never taken place, and the no vote was very clear about that. I wasn't sure, I didn't want to talk to Reconciliation Australia because I was that angry and I'd lost faith in the Australian community. I'm a little bit better now, I've moved on. I think the way that I made sense of it, and I spoke about this at the reconciliation meeting, was that Australia needs to wake up and have a look. There's a lot of people who voted no, but there are a lot of people who are non-Indigenous, who are feeling just as gutted as I was. So the pain wasn't just with the Aboriginal community, the pain was across the community. And I like to think about Homi Bhabha, who's an academic and talked a lot about the third space. Martin Nakata, a Torres Strait Islander man, talked about the intersectional space. And I'm a theoretical person. The theory behind that is that, the third space is where cultures come together and intersect. So if you think of a Venn diagram, the middle space where they intersect is the third space. And in Australia, we're all in the third space. And I was raised by my grandfather and thinking about how do you turn a negative situation into a positive outcome. And his advice and wisdom to me really stood me in good stead in about the vote. Because the third space is that, we're all in the third space. Whether you want to admit it or not, we are. We all bring our own views, our own cultures, our own biases, our own ways of thinking into that space. So the fact is that we all realise that those of us who were in favour of the yes vote because it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, and about acknowledging Australia's history of colonisation and truth-telling, it's an opportunity for us now to think about how we go forward and what type of country we want Australia to be for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and our future children when we're no longer here. What legacy do we want to leave? And I think this is where we really need to work together now and pull together about, okay, the no vote happened, why did it happen, and what can we do to ensure that social justice is seen into the future and that our children, not just our Indigenous children, but your children who are white, your children who may not be white Australians but are from another culture. We're all living in this land, we're all part of Australia. What do we want to see for our future and how do we work together? How do we work together? I think that's the collaborative word. But how do we also listen to and be led by Aboriginal leaders who know what needs to happen in this country and to overcome the bad effect of the no vote? We don't have to live with that. We can decide to move on. And I think for me, if I don't think that way, then like you, it's how do we deal with that trauma? And there are so many of our elders and our young people who are so traumatised that they've lost faith in the Australian community. They don't think that they have a future. They don't have belief in their own Aboriginal identity, and we've been working so long, so hard to try and give our kids a future to think about, and that being Aboriginal is not something to be ashamed of, which is what we were taught through colonisation, but it's about being proud that you come from a 60,000-year-old culture. How many countries and how many people can claim that? And this culture isn't dead, it's still here. There's a word in the artistic community called palimpsest, and I really loved that word when I was doing my thesis, because palimpsest is where you have a painting and you paint over it. You paint other realities, but underneath that reality, the original painting is still there. And Australia, to me, is an example of palimpsest. We've got white settler colonisation over the top of this country, but if you look underneath the surface, Aboriginal knowledge, Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal stories, Aboriginal songs, country is still there. It's still alive, it's still breathing, and it's here. We never went away, we're never going to go away, we've never ceded this land, and I think that that's a reality that we can all work together to try and change the face of this nation to make it a much more productive place and one where all of us can live together in harmony, recognising the First Nations people. That's kind of where I'm at now.
Great, yep. Okay, thanks very much. I might change tact and a little bit now, and I might also say I'd welcome questions from the audience. This is your opportunity to ask some experts before you this morning, so anytime please put your hand up if you'd like to ask some questions. I do want to get to the point of highlighting some of the work that drives us to get out of bed every single day, and I want to touch on Alex's work around precision medicine, Chris's work in driving a science and community engagement agenda at CSIRO, and Dawn about the importance of Indigenous knowledges, and perhaps a question for all of you about Indigenous data sovereignty, because I do think this is a really critical issue. Our communities are demanding much more about ownership of data and control of data, and rightly so, because we've been portrayed in very negative ways, described very negatively for many years by colonial settlers, and it is time for a massive change in the way. And I think Stephen said this morning that Aboriginal community-controlled organisations were leading the way, and I'm certainly involved in some work that really is trying to shift the balance of where data sits and is controlled and interpreted about us and for us. So I did see Fran Baums.
Yeah,
hi, Fran.
thanks, James. Just a question for Alex. Alex, you rightly described your anger, and this week we've seen an angry senator in Lydia Thorpe, who has challenged the King of Australia, I suppose. How did you react to Lydia's outburst, I suppose, but also her demand that the dispossession, etc., was recognised?
Yeah, I sort of thought this might come up today, I must say.
I'm glad it has.
Yeah, so I'm glad you didn't have to ask me that, James, so thanks, Fran. It's completely, understandably, justifiably an expression of anger that needs to be heard by the colonial project. I don't think that outburst will help us. This is my personal view. But as we know, certainly from our side, we need all of those voices to be brought to bear to raise the issues that matter most. So we need the advocates, we need the angry voices, we need the sensible diplomacy, we need the thoughtful, pragmatic, scientific response, we need the policy nuance, we need all of those to be able to express our concerns and our needs. The biggest challenge, and most of the focus is currently on Senator Thorpe, no one's asking a question of the Australian media who have gaslit her from moment 0.01, right? The questions that she's been asked in response to that outburst have all been about her allegiance to the Crown and her disrespect. Nothing about the substance of her concerns, which is the Crown has a responsibility to the people it screwed over. Now, we can boil it down in 1,000 different ways, and there's probably more kinder ways without swearing to express that. But she was attacked from moment one. And the question is, what does that represent about Australia? What does that mean about our civil institutions? What does it mean about the way in which Indigenous issues are heard and debated and discussed in Australia, just as it was a year ago with the referendum? We were gaslit, there was misinformation, there was a very strong and well-fought campaign to sow the seeds of doubt about the legitimacy of a very simple ask, just as there should be an openness to have the hard conversation about what does the Crown mean in the context of Aboriginal health disadvantage and what are all of our responsibilities to make an impact for the better. So whilst I wouldn't have done what Senator Thorpe did myself, and whether or not I think it's going to help or not, I think she has every right to raise whatever concern she has, and she should be heard, and we should have a proper grown-up conversation about what it represents and what we need to do better for the future. Unfortunately, we're not going to get a grown-up conversation in Indigenous affairs in this nation, certainly not for the next little while, and that's my gravest concern.
Great, thank you. Dawn? Chris, did you want to comment? Dawn or Chris?
Yeah, I think that I agree with Alex. I probably wouldn't have behaved in that way, but we have a lot of disparate voices in the community, and each one of them needs to be heard. I think this is another opportunity for Australia to talk about the racism in this country, but it's been missed. The focus has been on Lydia personally, and no one's actually mentioned or talked about what was she actually saying. No one's acknowledged what she was saying is around the dispossession of our country, the recognition for our native title, our rights. It's all been about how badly she behaved. She should resign, her allegiance to the Crown, the amount of money she earns, which is a red herring. It's a red herring again, which Australia is very good at doing, in leading away from the real talk about the racism in this country and the message that she was sending. And I think it actually shows the desperation that you have to go to that extent to get the message across to King Charles. She did say that she'd written to him, she'd written all these letters trying to contact him, and she's been ignored. It just shows the desperation. So, it may not help the cause, but it's certainly got everybody talking about it. So it's brought it to international attention. Whether you think it was bad behaviour or not, some people do, because, the British are very much around decorum and protocol and all of that. Whereas our black fellas, we've always been known for our antisocial behaviours, and we don't stick to the norm. And I don't think there was an antisocial behaviour. I think it was a very angry woman who's voicing how a lot of Aboriginal people in this country are feeling, but haven't had the status or the authority to be able to do that. If it had been a normal person, they would have been arrested and thrown in jail. I can tell you that right now. Lydia used her power and her status to speak up, and I think there's a message in that around how everyone in this room can also use their power and status. I don't mean that you go out and scream at King Charles, but it's around how this organisation can use advocacy to help support Aboriginal people's fight for justice in this country. Yeah.
Great. Now, Chris, you're sitting quietly on the end here. I might pose a question to you about the work that you're doing at CSIRO and particularly how can the Academy and people in this room and people who might be listening online later on, how can we move forward from this? How do we work more meaningfully and engaging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in research into the future?
Thank you, James. And I'll just pick up on Dawn's intro to that about what can you do as health and medical researchers. Well, there's a lot that you can do. One of the things that we celebrate at CSIRO is that the great opportunity for science and research is the promise of partnership and engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country to be able to respectfully working with them to use that fundamental capability that this continent has of 60,000 years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge of how to live and survive and thrive for millennia here. But not just that traditional knowledge, which I'll get to a little bit more in a moment, but also those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives of how we work together, how we do things, and the benefits that that can bring to research and science. Indigenous cultural and intellectual property is that traditional knowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have used and gained through the application of observation and experimentation, transmitted through millennia by dance and story and song and changing the landscape and carving to create a body of knowledge based upon a particular worldview. And that is why CSIRO acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australia's first scientists. This is an invaluable resource which is unique to this country. As Australia's national science agency, we have to engage with that, but we need to be able to do it in a way that protects the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to engage with us or choose not to engage. That's got to be their call. We need to be able to engage in a way that is respectful, in partnership, that provides Indigenous leadership, that answers questions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities have, and that delivers benefit as defined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to them. The days of the great scientist wading out into the country to deliver the benefits of science and research to Aboriginal people is over. What we need is a change in the way we do things, a change in that mentality, which is already embodied in the Australian Research Code, in the IATSIS Code of Ethics, but very importantly, just announced by the government in the National Science and Research priorities. Priority number 3, traditional knowledge and working appropriately and correctly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to deliver scientific outcomes. But also in the Minister's National Science Statement, where he talked about delivering more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to lead science and research in this country. And that really requires an Indigenous STEM talent pipeline. Now, some of us have been through that pipeline, but we also know that there's over 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people each year graduating with a STEM degree, not in health sciences, but in physical sciences, environmental sciences, and the rest of the suite. So there is actually quite a bit of movement. At CSIRO, we've engaged with that through the Young Indigenous Women's STEM Academy, which supports young Indigenous women, over 640 young women ranging from junior high schools up to university graduation. We've endowed a series of scholarships at the Australian universities that are the highest performers in graduating young Aboriginal people with undergraduate science degrees. We've established an Indigenous graduate program which provides them with an opportunity to have a real job doing science and research that is properly paid with us, and then the opportunity to transfer that into a master's or a PhD. And we've also established an Indigenous Research Grants program, which is entirely Indigenous controlled, which applies those ideas of Indigenous leadership and benefit as defined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people doing stuff that communities and organisations actually want done. At the moment, as Alex, as board member knows, we've got over 90 projects involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in one way, shape or form. Of course, the organisation has a legacy and everything's on a spectrum. So some have, probably more than half of those already have Indigenous leadership, And it's part of that organisational change which you in this organisation and in the organisations where you spend your days need to provide leadership and to drive and to be looking for those elements where you can start to break down what is referred to in Priority Reform 3 of the National Closing Gap Agreement, which was signed in 2020 by every Australian government, as well as the Coalition of Peak Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. Priority Reform 3 talks about breaking down institutional racism. And that is the deliberate or not deliberate exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from control and power and having accountability towards them for the actions of institutions. So there is a significant amount of work that you can do today, now, in your places, to drive that change that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, great. I'm going to pose this next question to Alex. This morning we've had two excellent panels and presentations on the use of AI and digital health. And both of those areas seems to me that the horse has already bolted with absolute consultations with Indigenous peoples in both of those areas. Alex, you're moving into Indigenous genomics and the need for Indigenous genomics and the need for Aboriginal people in this country to be at the forefront, and I'm glad you're there. It might be one of those issues that we are left behind, but you have been leading some fantastic work in Indigenous genomics. Perhaps if you want to share, firstly, what Indigenous data sovereignty is and how you're thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty in the context of collecting genomics data from communities.
Thanks, James. So there's a lot in there. There's probably about 8 different questions.
Well, you're a smart man.
How are we going for time? It's very hard to get words out of me, as James knows. So a couple of things. One is, have we been left behind? Absolutely. But the great news is we don't have to do Me Too research. We can take what you guys have already done and say, well, it's not quite good enough for us. Let's add or expand the opportunities afforded. We can come back to that if we've got more time. But the Indigenous data sovereignty agenda is really now at a critical phase because it's been a movement of principle, and now we get to the point of what does that look like practically. So it began actually really at the sort of midpoint of the Human Genome Project, and there was engagement between all of the science leads of that agenda with some Indigenous folk, and the conversations did not go well. And largely those conversations did not go well because the science community would not agree to protect Indigenous interests or rights throughout that process. They didn't understand what they weren't willing to listen, and they weren't willing to put in place anything that would give us a level of comfort around what that meant. As a consequence, the Indigenous data sovereignty movement was born really from a bioethics perspective, which is how do we actually use the muscles we have as Indigenous people in research, which was largely around ethics. Over the last 15 years or so, we've seen this growth in very detailed and very comprehensive principles to guide what Indigenous data sovereignty is. And to boil it down, it's basically us having the right to decide what's measured and collected, for what purpose, by whom, who gets to look at it, who interprets it, who makes sense of it, who implements it. Right, and who can have access to that information. So it's very much aligned with the conversation we had earlier. The good news is approaches to Indigenous data sovereignty are probably best practice for all of you guys to consider in how to do things the right way and protect the interests of people and give agency to individuals within that process. The critical juncture for us now is how do we actually deploy it? How do we actually take the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and do stuff? And that requires probably a set of technological solutions, right? Not relying on goodwill, because see how well that's done us for the last 220 years. I'm sorry, guys, no good. But we can build data architecture that enforces Indigenous data sovereignty in the way in which it operates. We talked about data visitation before, talked about federated learning. These are approaches, particularly I think informed by Indigenous concerns around data and data sovereignty, of better ways to do this to protect everyone. And I think we're now in this critical phase of seeing how Indigenous people can guide a better way for all. And our ambition is to make sure that how genomics is done, including the data sovereignty and the Indigenous genomic data ecosystem, but how genomics is applied for benefit equitably is a piece of work that Indigenous Australians should lead and can lead and will lead.
Great. I might open to the floor for any questions.
I'll just give a specific example of that, if you like, James. Right, thanks. Last year we embarked upon a piece of work in response to interest from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about the linkage between jobs that were advertised and jobs that were available. So employment job market's very interesting for Indigenous job seekers. Using AI, we examined over 8 million online job ads and were able to come up with some very interesting findings around, and this is available on the CSIRO website if you want to have a look, some very interesting findings about the relationship between where jobs were, the qualifications that people had, and what employers were looking for. And this was really looking at jobs that were identified positions which were specifically there for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or where they were Indigenous preferred positions, or the employer made a statement that they welcomed applications from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But the guts of this is about the bias that we detected developing within the AI as it was being trained, particularly around regarding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander job seekers as only being appropriate for low-level jobs, which is where many, but not all, and in about 3 different industries, that most of the jobs were being advertised. So this required the Indigenous leadership from the Indigenous researchers involved in that project to keep on retraining the AI to work with the data outcomes to develop something which was actually fit for purpose. So that's part of the value, but the value proposition of Indigenous leadership within a particular research project, but also the justice and ethical outcomes which are inherent in the whole project.
Great.
Hi. So I sit on a number of sort of committees and societies, as I think many people in the room do. And I think many of us really want to engage and understand the Indigenous voice and understand the things that we need to be considering in whatever area of work we're doing. But I think there aren't enough Indigenous experts, and there's a lot of demand that's being put on the experts in our field. And how do we, I guess Chris sort of talked about hopefully some pathways that might help improve that in the future. I guess how do we, in the interim, perhaps try and address that?
Well, I'll just kick off and I'd say there's 750,000 Aboriginal people in this country. That's a lot of people. There are a lot of experts. There are hundreds of dental practitioners, hundreds of Indigenous doctors. In any particular field, you will find someone. One of the things that I did when I joined CSIRO in 2021 is said that every position in the team that I lead needs to be identified, because I need the cultural capability that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are able to bring to pool collectively together to deliver the best bang for the buck in our team as we go forward. So we did that. In my team, I'm proud to have a marine biologist with a PhD, 2 lawyers, and a bunch of other highly talented, very capable people. And these were jobs for which there were significant numbers of applicants. So let me say to you that if you're having trouble actually recruiting someone, the problem may not be with the job market, it may be with you as the organisation and how you're doing it and what you're doing. And this is actually information that comes out of the diversity management literature in the US, where a lot of work has actually been done about how to actually effectively recruit people. But probably a subject of a bigger conversation, which I can have later if you like.
Yeah, I think I'm the lead of the Centre for Research Excellence around the Good Spirit, Good Life, which is my team, and work very closely with Dr. Kate Smith, and who's developed a quality of life tool for assessing quality of life with Aboriginal older people. And it's a tool that we've developed for service providers to be able to assess whether older people in care have got a quality of life, and it's called the Good Spirit, Good Life. Now, we could not have done that if we did not have the input from the community. And the first thing that we did was went out to the community to talk to elders, to bring them in to see if they would be interested. And they've been with us all throughout the whole 3 years on developing the tool. So I think, to pick up on what you've said, Chris, perhaps the issue is not that there's a lack of experts out there, but it's the way in which organisations or researchers are or are not engaging with the Aboriginal community. You know, I was in Alice Springs not long ago for a meeting, and it was because I also have a background in family and domestic violence and sit on a national research committee, ANROS, as an independent Indigenous director around family violence, and we were meeting in Alice Springs. And went to a number of different meetings, visited a lot of Aboriginal organisations and communities, and was absolutely amazed at what the Aboriginal organisations were doing to address family violence in Alice Springs. Went to a non-Indigenous community meeting, and I looked around, there was not one Aboriginal person sitting at the table, and they were talking about how difficult it was to work with family violence in the Aboriginal community, and that they didn't know what to do. And I thought, you don't know what to do? I've just come from a bunch of Aboriginal organisations who are doing amazing things. Why isn't anyone sitting at this table? Because it again comes down to that colonising worldview that only non-Indigenous people have got the answers. Only they can decide for Aboriginal people, whereas Aboriginal people were getting on with it. They were doing it. So I guess my point is that the community's there, the expertise is in the community. You just have to get out there and talk to them. Now, if you don't know how to do that, then get some Aboriginal people, talk to Aboriginal people within your organisation, or even ring up and say, you know, look, I'd really like to come out and talk to you. Aboriginal people work with relationships. Relational theory is very well known, and it's very well known within Indigenous ways of doing things. People will talk to you if they've met you. They won't talk to you if you're a voice on the phone, because they don't know who you are. And it comes down to, what is your purpose? Why do you want this information? What are you going to do with it? Which Alex has talked about, particularly in relation to the Genome Project. So, you know, it's the time for taking information from communities with no reciprocity coming back is gone. Aboriginal people now want to know, if you want to come and talk to me, you want my knowledge, what are you going to use it for, and what acknowledgement is going to come back to my community, and how is it going to benefit my community? It's not doing research for research's sake, or because you're curious about this, or because you're interested, but it has to be a real world issue that's going to change things for us at the community level. So there's a whole lot of changes now happening in our communities where people are wanting to get recognised. They're actually demanding accountability. So what I would suggest is find out who's who in your area. Go and introduce yourself to some of the organisations. Sit down and yarn. It's not going to be easy, but if you start making those attempts, people will start to warm to you. And I think the expertise, we've got a lot of elders out there, particularly, you know, I work with elders all the time. One of the real concerns that a lot of our communities have now, particularly in the area of dementia, because that's what the GSGL tool is also around, is we're working with dementia and the impact of dementia in communities. And we know that dementia is a real concern because it takes away memory, and older people are the repositories of our knowledge systems. And so handing on that expertise and that knowledge is important. So how do we support communities to retain that? So I think my message is that I used to hear this all the time from organisations that would say, we haven't got any Aboriginal people working in our organisations because we can't recruit them. And then I'd say, do you have an Aboriginal person on your board? No. So it's around changing the way you do business. Go out and talk to the Aboriginal mob. Sometimes people will say, but we want to talk to you, Dawn. And I go, yeah, but you know what? I'm not the only expert in the crowd. And it's time to start growing up our younger ones who've got knowledge, to start to put them into positions where they're the upcoming leaders. And we need to step aside to be able to enable some of our younger ones to have that experience. So don't get stuck because perhaps the person you do want to talk to is not available. As Chris has said, there's a lot of other people out there, and the elders are out there, and they do love to share their knowledge. As long as you're clear and you're genuine about what you want to do and how you're going to acknowledge and put that back to the community, not just take it. I still have a lot of communities that I work with that go, you know what? You guys are the first researchers that have come in here and have talked to us about data sovereignty and what our rights are. We have a lot of researchers that have come in, done research with us, taken the knowledge away, and we have never heard from them since. We don't know what the outcome of it was. So, you know, talking about IDDS, it's also around how can you use the data that you're collecting to give back to communities to enable them to leverage it when they go to government and want to apply for funding. Government is always saying to our communities, give us the evidence. Give us the evidence. Well, if you guys have got the evidence, give it back to the communities and teach them about how they can use that evidence to leverage the funding and the services and the supports, because that's not happening. And this is what people are saying now. You want to come and you want to work with us, then this is the way to do it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Melissa, you've got the final question, so make it a good one. We're on time, so no pressure.
No pressure. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to this panel. This has been really excellent. Professor Bessarab, you were kind of commenting on where I was hoping to ask about, but one of the things that I've certainly observed is there's an incongruity between the way that, you know, someone like me is used to working. I know I can text Xiao at 11 p.m. and be like, hey, we got a grant due tomorrow. Can you read this thing real quick? And do you want to be on it? And also a letter of support. And I know, you know, it's not an appropriate way to engage with Aboriginal people. And thinking about how us, you know, settler researchers or non-Aboriginal researchers can change our practices and set our expectations appropriately for how that engagement would go, if I could invite you to comment.
I think the thing is as soon as you know you want to work with Aboriginal people, or you've got a research grant that, if you want to work with Aboriginal people, or you've got a research grant that you are thinking of doing, involve them right at the very beginning so they're part of the decision-making process. I've had emails from people that have said, I've just received this grant, and in looking at it, I realised that there's a component in there that involves Aboriginal people. Are you interested, or can you tell me how I can get Aboriginal people involved? And it's like, yeah, really? When all the decisions have been made, you now want to bring the black fellas into your grant? Don't think so. It's not going to happen. Aboriginal people get really pissed off. Sorry for the language, but I'll be honest. I'm on the fellow now. I've got to watch my behaviour. They get really angry, to be more polite, because they should be involved right at the very beginning, and not just involved at the beginning and then left, but right throughout the whole process. Because if we're talking about data sovereignty and we're talking about real recognition, then having an Aboriginal person or an Aboriginal reference group, which is what seems to be the go at the moment, to guide your research, then you're not stuck with those issues of getting letters of support and thinking, oh my goodness, we haven't got it. Because letters of support, as we know, talking about data sovereignty and ethics, getting letters of support from an Aboriginal organisation can take time, because it's also got to go through an Aboriginal ethics committee. So you can start thinking about that stuff at the beginning. So right from the very beginning, start identifying who the Aboriginal people are in your area and who you might ring up and ask if they'd be interested in coming on board. Yeah, it's thanks. Not rocket science.
Chris,
and that's got to be with decision-making, with leadership. The days of come along to us with your, and we can be part of your advisory group are over in research. It has to be, and this is embedded within the research code, it's part of the IATSIS Code of Ethics. I sit as co-chair of the IATSIS Research Ethics Committee, and it's really important for researchers to consider from the get-go for projects which involve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or issues that are important to them, that they embed Indigenous leadership within that. And that can be as part of the research team, as multiple researchers, as chief investigators, as the case, as Dawn has said, with a Indigenous reference group which has decision-making power. And that's probably really, people sort of also talk a little bit about co-design and think it's sort of some like turbocharged consultation mechanism. No, co-design is a governance mechanism. That's where everybody sitting around the table has the yes/no decision power. So that's what I talk about when I talk about co-design at CSIRO. Another way, and I know Alex has got 100 ways to introduce Indigenous leadership, but the third one I'd like to talk about is using contract law. If you are, in particularly for us where we're maybe doing research that doesn't involve human research, then it's important to have an agreement with the organisation, a contract with the organisation about what you're going to do, who's responsible, and what the intended outcomes are and the benefits that they're expecting from that piece of research. And that then forms a basis of control, of legal control and accountability for the researchers for the work that they're doing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Okay, final word to Professor Brown.
Excellent.
A few words.
Yes, very few words. I saw the time up at the back there. 1 year on from the referendum, what have we learnt? Never trust a scoundrel. Second, if you want to bet on how things are going to go in terms of decisions in a racialised environment, always trust racism to win the day. The last is, what can the Academy do? Hand over. What do you got to lose? Your careers are set. The Academy is for people who are at advanced stages of their careers who have made major and critical contributions to our nation. You have got nothing to lose by finding the jewels in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and backing them in to be a part of this esteemed and learned Academy, and allow Indigenous people to lead. And I think that's probably an important lesson from the referendum. Irrespective of what was said, we can make those choices as colleagues and as friends and as collaborators to allow Indigenous people their rightful place at the table, including within the Academy and all the other circles in which all of you very successful people move. So that's the challenge. Give us a hand.
Thank you very much. I knew it would be a challenge to cover what we intended to do in 45 minutes, particularly when we've got three stellar colleagues on the stage who love a good yarn. So thank you very much, Alex, Dawn and Chris, for your contributions this afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Look, fantastic panel, and look, thanks so much for your honesty and your knowledge and expertise, and guiding us into what we can do to support First Nations people. And really just to say we were all gutted by the outcome, but I think it's a real motivator for us all to do what we can to support First Nations people. So with that, we're now going to break for lunch and look forward to seeing all those happy smiling faces back at 2:30. Thank you.